Thank you for joining Political Research Associates today for a roundtable discussion on religious freedom and the machinations of the Christian right. We encourage you to drop your name and location in the chat so we can see who all is with us on this call today. Please remember to set your chat setting to all panelists and attendees so everyone can see who's with us. For those of you who may be new to Political Research Associates, PRA is a national nonprofit entering its 40th year. We provide research, analysis, and strategy recommendations to understand and combat anti-democratic forces. By exposing patriarchal and racist movements, PRA defends a vision of feminist multiracial democracy. In honor of this year's Religious Freedom Day, which falls on Saturday, January 16th, we are starting 2021 with a discussion on the protection of religious freedom as ensured by the first constitutional amendment, and a look at the ways in which the Christian right have both appropriated the concept and seek at every turn to undermine it. We are also convening this panel of experts and practitioners just days after a violent act of insurrection and just days before a dramatic shift in this country's elected government. As a powerful coalition on the right, one with disproportionate electoral and judicial influence, the Christian right remains a significant threat to democracy and civil rights as we move into a new era. For this discussion, we are joined by Reverend Dr. Carrie Jackson, Director of Spiritual Care and Activism for the Religious Coalition for Reproductive Choice, Catherine Joyce, journalist, educator, and editor of The Public Eye, PRA's peer-reviewed quarterly magazine, Minnesota State Senator John Marty, and ex-evangelical writer, speaker, and advocate, Chrissy Stroop. We are also hoping that we will be joined at some point in this conversation by Frederick Clarkson, a senior research analyst here at PRA. We are honored to have you all with us for this important conversation. Thank you, panelists and audiences, for joining us today. I'm going to start us off with a quote written by Frederick Clarkson. Fred wrote that religious freedom is, quote, the right of individual conscience to believe or not believe as we choose, without undue influence from government or powerful religious institutions, and to practice our beliefs free from the same constraints. Oh, here's Fred right here. I will give Fred a second to have his audio connect. Hi, Fred, welcome. Thank you for joining. Oh, you're muted.
Phew, computer glitches always happen at the most inconvenient times.
They absolutely do. Fred, I was in the middle of a quote from you, but I'm actually going to pivot so that you can help us set up this conversation with a short summary of what Religious Freedom Day commemorates, with a specific consideration of the historical context in which US religious freedom was founded, looking at specifically the contemporary norms surrounding religious tolerance and pluralism, and the boundaries between church and state at the time when Jefferson penned the Virginia Statute for Religious Freedom. How is this understanding of religious freedom a departure from those norms?
Well, sure. Thanks, Koki. The roots of Religious Freedom Day are in the dramatic days in the run-up to the American Revolution. It was a time of increased persecution by the British Empire, as well as increased resistance. Times were tense. The Anglican Church, also known as the Church of England, was the established church, meaning that there were no others allowed, and it enjoyed a close relationship with the colonial government, and people were directly taxed to support it. At the time, one also had to be a member of the Anglican Church, and if you wanted to be married, you had to be married by an Anglican priest, and pay him, of course. And it was illegal to be married outside the church, which is to say, your marriage would not count. It was a crime not to attend church. And sometimes Anglican vestries were deputized to round up the miscreants. Baptist preachers caught preaching the gospel as they understood it were sometimes beaten and jailed. That's why James Madison inserted into the Virginia Declaration of Rights, authored by George Mason, adopted by the Revolutionary Virginia Convention on June 12, 1776, a provision that generally guaranteed the free exercise of religion. A few weeks later, Thomas Jefferson, fresh from having drafted the Declaration of Independence in Philadelphia, came home and drafted the Virginia Statute for Religious Freedom in 1777. The bill read in part, and please forgive the odd-sounding 18th century English, all men shall be free to profess and by argument to maintain their opinions in matters of religion. and that the same shall in no wise diminish, enlarge, or affect their civil capacities. In modern English, we might simply say that your religious identity or lack thereof is neither an advantage or a disadvantage in your status as a citizen. The bill helped to rally Virginia's Baptists and Presbyterians to the cause of the revolution because they saw, being persecuted minorities at the time, that a vision of a future free from persecution by the Anglican Church. It was a future in which they could attend their own churches or not, without fear that mounted religious enforcers would hunt them down. The Virginia Statute was thus the final disentangling of the Anglican Church from the state government, what we call disestablishment. I would hasten to add, though, that when Jefferson and Madison said religion, they meant something broader than religious belief. Madison said that freedom of religion meant the right of individual conscience, and Jefferson's synonym was freedom of the mind. So the point here is that freedom of religion is not necessarily what we may think of as religion. The legislation also makes clear that freedom of religion also means freedom from religion in the sense that I think most people who use that phrase intend. Still, Jefferson was worried about backsliding and revisionism regarding his legacy, and he later wrote that the vision of religious freedom intended by the statute encompasses, quote, the Jew and the Gentile, the Christian and the Muslim, the Hindu and the infidel of every denomination. He was not wrong to think that some later theocrats and monarchists would show up to try to revise, repeal, or co-opt religious freedom. We're certainly seeing that today. But from the time Jefferson wrote it to the time it was enacted, it took almost a decade. And then under the legislative leadership of James Madison, it followed then his historic legislative victory with the Virginia Statute, who traveled to Philadelphia in 1787, where he was the principal author of the Constitution. And 2 years later, he was a principal author of the First Amendment. So unsurprisingly, the Virginia Statute has been long understood by scholars and by the Supreme Court to be an authoritative source for the meaning of religious freedom.
Thank you, Fred. Before we move away from the historical context of this concept, I have a question to pose all of our panelists. How do we reconcile the fact that religious freedom as a progressive value is needed now more than ever, but simultaneously so is a reckoning of the racism of the founding fathers and the white supremacy that underpins the US state? Who would like to tackle this one?
Everybody's being shy. No, I think we have to recognize that in the same way that some of the Christian nationalists, people who are trying to make Christianity the religion of the country, in the same way that they are saying that the nation's founders were all Christian. They think our country was founded in, well, in some ways it was founded by white people who were oppressing other people. And the whole concept of freedom is supposed to be something, when we say all people are created equal, we mean all people. When we say religious liberty, as Fred said, Jefferson meant religious freedom for everyone. And I think it's not inconsistent. I mean, the whole concept of tackling our racism and all of our gender biases, all of our other problems, our discrimination society, is the same thing as why we have to protect this. Somebody said that basically our slavery and other things were a birth defect of our nation. And in a sense, the idea that our religion, that it's meant for our freedom is meant for certain people, that's a stain on our democracy, and one that we've been working for 240 years to try and heal. And I think we have to continue that, but this is all one and the same. The racism, the sexism, the religious pushing of some over the others and discriminate against people is the ideals our nation really was founded on, albeit very imperfectly.
Yeah, I would just add to that, Koki, that there's the idea that this profoundly liberatory thing we call religious freedom came out of this morass of racism and genocide and extraordinary criminality, that the very people who were opposing empire and colonialism effectively replaced them domestically. And so, but what they did do was they gave us this extraordinary idea of religious freedom. And that is it's like, okay, well, we still have an empire of sorts, but you are free to think differently than the people who hold power. And you have the idea, you can therefore speak differently, and therefore you can have oppositional press, and you can organize politically differently. That was the opening, and they recognized that they realized that their time as rulers might end and should end. And that is the extraordinary paradox of American culture and democracy that we actually still live through in many respects today.
So this may not be a completely direct answer to a complex question, but when you talk about needing to urgently to address religious freedom and decolonization at this time, or to address racism and how it's continuing to shape American politics today, one thing that I think it's important to point out is how intertwined white supremacy is with white Christianity, and particularly the white evangelical tradition. So the same people who are trying to argue that religious freedom means their freedom to discriminate against other people in a Christian nation are the primary people who are fighting to maintain white supremacism, though many of them would not admit to that. For example, the 6 seminaries in the Southern Baptist Convention recently issued a statement condemning critical race theory and intersectionality as incompatible with Baptist theology, incompatible with the Bible as Southern Baptists understand it. Now, this is a church that, of course, was founded in the 1840s amid disputes over slavery, because what the churches that became the Southern Baptist Convention wanted to maintain that one can be a slaveholder and a Christian missionary against the Northern Baptist churches that argued that those two things were incompatible. The Southern Baptist Convention has apologized for that legacy, and yet it fails to fully reckon with it, right? And this is quite obvious. I mean, this rejection, explicit rejection by official Southern Baptist structures of anti-racist scholarship and anti-racist analytical tools is quite a striking thing that has happened at this time. And so for someone like, Albert Mohler, who is the head of the flagship Southern Baptist Seminary, to come along and say after last Wednesday's insurrection that he's shocked that Christians would do this, that they would form a mob and storm the Capitol in support of a racist president, is really quite rich. He just basically made this very racist move, and now he's saying, well, I can't believe people would actually take that to the streets and try to overturn an election. Anyway, those are the kinds of things I think about when you bring up how urgently we need both of these things to address both of these issues. And when we talk about addressing religious freedom, of course, we have to take it back from the people who are twisting it and using it for domination, which of course has been one of the main themes of Fred's excellent writings on the topic for a long time. And he eventually convinced me, because for a while I thought, there's no way we can reclaim religious freedom. Let's just try something else. But now I completely agree that he's right.
Wonderful. Well, hopefully we can convince the 76 people who are currently watching this of the same thing. I'm going to continue. Several of you have already touched on sort of the fundamental protections afforded by this first freedom. And Fred, right before you jumped on, was just reading your quote on how religious freedom is the right of individual conscience. And so I want us to talk a little bit about what are some of the political and material consequences at stake in the preservation of religious freedom. This is a broad question, and it's an open question to any of our panelists who'd like to take the first go.
Well, I'll jump in here. Many of you may know that there was an election in Georgia a week ago. There have been so many things happening that got pushed to the back burner in lots of ways. But in the context of that, one of the issues that was raised by some regarding Raphael Warnock, who's now senator-elect, was that he could not be a Christian minister and be supporter of reproductive freedom, that he didn't have the right to have a conscience of his own that would embrace both of those, that in many ways he didn't have the right to be a whole person and bring his theology and his politics in this intersectional way that came out with a different result from what some people thought he should have. Conscience within Catholicism, some of you may know, there is a doctrine within Catholic teaching that says primacy of conscience. The conscience has greater weight than teachings of the church, and I love that. Martin Luther, who was one of the shapers of the Reformation, also talked about the importance of conscience, and that following even behind the church hierarchy was not as critical in his own spiritual and religious understanding as following his conscience. And so we're in this era now where people are being villainized if their understanding of their conscience does not align with someone else. That is a supremacist orientation that really not only flies in the face of what it means to be human living in dignity, it also flies in the face of what it means to be a democratic republic. Conscience is something so valuable and so important. And we were talking before we got on the call and talking about the conscience of the current president. And so when we talk about conscience, we also have to recognize that some people are sociopaths and psychopaths. That's a reality, and therefore are likely to be amoral. But for most of us, conscience leads us to a deep morality that is rooted in compassion and love. But that base nature is always there. Conscience, I believe, for most of us, guides us to our higher nature that opens our hearts and our minds and our politics to a way of being in society with one another that I think is really critical. And I didn't get to answer your first question, but I'm gonna squeeze this in. And that is, religion is so important because it shapes our understanding of what it means to be human and what it means to be human in society with other humans. And so we need to have that range of opportunities for people who are religiously affiliated and those who are not to come to the table with their fullest and their highest conscience. And I think that makes such a huge difference for us in this era. Not their fear, but their conscience. And I think some people confuse those, the acts that we've seen, acts of violence, that's not people following their conscience. That's people following their fear.
Thank you, Carrie. That's a really important distinction to make. Would anyone else like to chime in on the material consequences of protecting religious and
I'll say that I politically, I didn't see much reason to discuss religious freedom because who's opposed to it? First Amendment right, who's opposed to it? It was only in the last, I'd say 15 years or so that we've seen attacks on religious liberty, weirdly or ironically perhaps, under the guise of people saying they were in favor of religious liberty. And they're using religious liberty, I think from PRA or somewhere I learned the quote of Gary North, who 30, 40 years ago was saying how he wants to use religious liberty to get more for their right-wing Christian schools and so on, to build up a whole generation of Christian believers so they can take away religious liberty then from all the enemies of God. I mean, that's bizarre. They're saying we're going to use religious liberty or pretend to use religious liberty to get more support for our folks so we can crush everybody else. And so I never had seen this risk of people using it, but now in the political world, I have colleagues who are trying to use it for anti-LGBTQ purposes. They're trying to use it to push a right-wing agenda, and they have rights to their religious beliefs. My problem, I want them to. That's why I want to defend religious liberty, but they don't have the right to impose their religious beliefs on everybody else, which is the difficulty. They are using the issue we say we're trying to protect. They're saying we care about protecting that in order to undermine it. And I think that's what we have to speak against.
Thank you, Senator Marty. This is a great transition to our next question, thinking through sort of rhetorical strategies. Catherine, I'm going to pivot to you. You wrote a piece for the New Republic in 2019 on Christian right biblical agendas couched in the language of rational natural law. Can you talk us through how this rhetorical strategy functions and the way it interacts with religious freedom?
Yeah, thank you. And this is so interesting. Everything that everybody is saying is so interesting. So I'm glad to be here. So I wrote this piece. It's going on 2 years ago now, shortly after the State Department announced that it was going to form a new body, which it was calling the Commission on Unalienable Rights. And the purpose of this commission, which did not go through, any sort of notification of kind of the normal human rights bodies that are in or around government here in the US, it had this mandate that it was going to provide fresh thinking about human rights discourse, where that discourse has departed from America's founding principles of natural law and natural rights. So to translate that, essentially the job of this commission was to provide a new framework for the State Department under Trump, obviously, through which it could consider what is a valid human rights issue. So kind of unpacking that a little bit, it relied a lot on this idea of natural law. And I'm not a theologian, so forgive my kind of rough paraphrase here. But it's this tradition largely founded on Catholic theology that argues God has established a rational order to the universe. And so there are these rules or laws that apply to everybody, and that you can reach through sort of human reasoning rather than religious conviction. And because of that, that makes, these rules, these natural laws make a good basis for secular laws and policy. Today, though, natural law, at least as it's used by the Christian right here in the US, it's used mostly as a justification to disregard LGBTQ rights. Without, it's advancing a religious right agenda, but with this fig leaf of, this isn't, religious motivation, this is natural law, this is something that human reasoning can bring you to. So for example, you could say, natural laws has this premise of, there are these inherent human goods, like procreation is an inherent human good. And so they would say it's justifiable for societies to create laws like banning same-sex marriage or upholding anti-sodomy laws that accord with that principle, that procreation is an inherent human good, that this is part of the natural law. Peter Montgomery, one of sort of PRA's family friends over at Right Wing Watch, put it this way, that it's a way for religious conservatives to achieve their goals without having to admit that these are religious goals. I could go on a bit. The commission was really, it seems like it was largely the brainchild of Robbie George, who is this leading intellectual on the Christian right. Fred, I think, could probably tell us an awful lot about him and the Manhattan Declaration, this sort of effort to bring conservative believers from many different traditions together and align them on culture war objectives. But that was an effort that they sort of defined and promoted in terms of natural law. And so the Commission on Unalienable Rights is sort of a natural progression of this. And it took it a bit further. One thing that I think is worth pointing out is that George and his supporters on the commission, they believe that human rights discourse has become inflated, that, you know, the concept of human rights has been larded with all of these things that aren't really legitimate human rights, such as reproductive rights, you know, or the rights of LGBTQ people, or, you know, also kind of expanded understandings of kind of religious freedom and personal freedoms. They really think kind of the most basic and the only really legitimate human rights are related to property rights and religious freedom, of course, as defined by conservative Christians. George is really dismissive when he talks about other conceptions, broader conceptions that probably most of us here share about human rights. And he put it this way, quote, "Whatever people desire, they'll treat it not as a desire, a want, a feeling, a passion, but rather as a human right. And we lose our sense of the power and importance of the fundamental rights because of the inflation that happens when you conflate whatever it is you desire, whatever is on your agenda, with rights. I have the right to my lifestyle, whatever my lifestyle is," end quote. That's Robbie George. Why this matters is kind of twofold. It's pretty clearly aimed at international law and US foreign relations, you know, things like United Nations agreements that the US does or doesn't sign on to, laws at the EU, or kind of policies and statements from like international bodies like the Organization of American States. So it matters in terms of those sort of precedents, and also what we're signaling to other countries about what issues the US is willing to go, you know, to the mat for. But it also has this target that's closer to home, as you know, the US and US conservatives have long since realized that international law, international agreements, they have this sort of boomerang effect. They can be cited in policy arguments, in court battles back here in the US. So, you know, there is that kind of that policy and foreign policy and kind of legal policy arm of it. And then I think also it's worth pointing out like how deeply embedded that this is becoming in some sectors of the Christian right, and particularly the Catholic right. In 2019, the Catholic University of America actually began a new grad school program teaching human rights from a Catholic perspective. So basically teaching human rights from this perspective, this natural law perspective that I was just talking about. So that's basically the creation of a whole pipeline of young policy wonks who are gonna kind of go out and, you know, draft policy, help kind of advocate for policy along those lines, trained in this new definition of human rights, that the only legitimate human rights really belong to conservative Christians. So that's kind of what that was about.
Thank you, Catherine. I think that's an excellent example of the sort of rhetorical machinations of the Christian right, which relate deeply to this conversation. We have touched on this a little bit, and I think it's impossible not to in this political moment, but culminating with the chaotic failed coup attempt last Wednesday, we have seen an acceleration of the slippage of democracy over the last 4 years under Donald Trump. How has Trump's opportunistic cooperation with the Christian right over the past 4 years impacted the protections afforded by religious freedom and our understanding of the concept itself, both rhetorically and in practice? And more broadly, what role has his cooperation with the Christian right played in this democratic erosion? Catherine, you talked a little bit about this with the natural law relationship with human rights and the interpretation of human rights. So I'd like to open the question to all of you for other examples of this democratic erosion under Trump through this relationship, and any other particularly significant components of that relationship that you might want to talk about.
I've got some things to say there, if that's all right. So one of my pet peeves in sort of, let's say, our elite public sphere discourse right now when it comes to Trump and the Christian right is that we often see people saying, oh, Trump has just corrupted all these Christians, or he's bent them to their will. He's using these poor rubes. This is completely wrong on every level. As Catherine was just discussing, I mean, when you have a lot of lawyers and lobbyists and very smart conservative Christians putting this in the language of natural law, that shows a degree of sophistication. And I think that really we need to flip the script there and assert that the Christian right, its leadership, has been using Trump even more than he's been using them. He certainly recognizes that they are his base. Right-wing white Christians, especially white evangelicals, are his base. And he has actively pursued their agenda and pushed more of it through than any previous president. You know, even George W. Bush, with some of his holy war rhetoric around the Iraq war, was not actually going to take the destabilizing and frankly stupid foreign policy step of moving the US embassy in Israel from Tel Aviv to Jerusalem, which Trump explicitly said he did for evangelicals because, you know, most American Jews didn't want that move on the basis of their biblical prophecy. But also Trump has used the bureaucracy to create these new sort of bodies for our participation in international legal arenas to pursue a right-wing vision of Christian, of religious freedom, that is. And he's at every opportunity pushed through anti-LGBTQ rules and anti-woman, anti-abortion rules in the bureaucracy. So, you know, Trump did exactly what the Christian right wanted him to do. And we have to look at him as a symptom rather than a cause. I grew up in this right-wing Christian milieu, and I could have told you, you know, that it's always been authoritarian. I mean, that streak has certainly been there, and it has been prominent among evangelicals since around the time I was born, 1980. I mean, it became increasingly so, right? It's through the 80s and the 90s that we saw this big purge of liberals in the Southern Baptist Convention, so that, you know, people like Jimmy Carter could never be in its leadership again. And that authoritarianism is something that they wanted to bring as much as they could into the political arena, and not just within their own denominational structures. And they've been more and more successful at doing that, but particularly under Trump. So, you know, there's a long-term process of the erosion of democracy here, which Trump kind of comes along and then pushes it further. But it took, you know, a lot of successes for the right wing, and particularly the Christian right, to make that possible. And, you know, when it comes to things like natural law discourse, that the legacy there is of social contract theory, you know, which is actually really ambiguous. So most authoritarians are not going to tell you that they are anti-freedom, right? A few will admit it, but most actually say no, they're pro-freedom, but they have a sort of notion of positive liberty. I mean, if you look at the French Enlightenment, there's very different camps here, where, you know, Jean-Jacques Rousseau actually uses the language of, well, if people don't know what's good for them, you can force them to be free. Whereas, you know, Voltaire was very opposed to that sort of thing. Or in the British Enlightenment tradition, Hobbes, very authoritarian notion, although at least he was sort of more honest about the idea of limiting freedom. Locke, less so. And I think there's also, when we think about this in terms of theology, we might think that arguing theology or things like apologetics, the defense of the faith, is apolitical. But in fact, natural law theology shows us a simple way in which this can be mapped onto the political sphere and secularized. This is something that apologists have been doing for a long time, sometimes just intellectually to try to convince someone to convert, but you can also do this in the courts, right? So when you're arguing against Prop 8, making legal arguments, you can't say that you don't want people of the same sex to be married because it's against your religion. So you try to come up with phony science that makes it look like it's a public good to keep same-sex people from being married. The idea here, and I'm sorry for the sort of long-winded way of getting around to it, for authoritarians who say they believe in freedom, is that there is only one way to be free, and there's only one path that leads to human flourishing. And so any true freedom is something that pushes people along that path toward that end. Anything that falls outside of it isn't really justified. That's the effect of that rhetoric, I think.
Would anyone else like to chime in on this question? There's like 4 years of content that we could talk through.
Well, something I learned from Chrissy a few years ago was about the words "in God we trust" on our currency. And I did not know, because I was born in 1956. So Chrissy let me know that a couple years before I was born is when that was placed on the currency. That was one of those slippery slopes, if you will, in our nation, where a particular perspective is imposed on all of the people. And that was something very much in response to the Cold War. And so our nation and our religions in this nation have often used fear to push people in a particular way that has them relinquish their inalienable rights, has them relinquish what is good and right with their own conscience in order for some measure, or at least the veneer of it, of safety. So we're in this context now where we're battling between democracy and theocracy. And when I say theocracy, for me, a theocratic state is really an oligarchy. It is really run by a few, and they put some God language on top of it. It's really a few people, and we can look at that around the world, where there are leaders who use religion for power and control of the people. And so we're in this moment now where, and I think last week's insurrection really points to it, that it's a fight between democracy and some notion of theocracy. So this particular time that we are celebrating religious freedom, it is something that pushes us to ask the question, how much do we really want to be a democratic society? And what are the choices we need to make along the way? And what kinds of things do we need to check? Because otherwise we slide into something that aligns with more people, or aligns with some people who want to have a theocratic state out of their orientation and their notion of the book of Genesis in particular: be fruitful and multiply and rule over, have dominion over everything. And that's a particular understanding of that text. And as you were saying, the Christian right, the evangelicals, were really using Donald Trump. And so many people kept saying, why are they say they believe in morals, and he's one of the most not amoral but immoral persons. Why would they? And of course, there's an answer to that. And Chrissy has really spoken to that.
I argue quickly that Trump used them and they used him. It was a symbiotic relationship where they both benefited from it. But when we talk about, the whole idea of theocracy is the opposite of freedom of religion. It's somebody telling you what you're going to do, and they are very much saying they're in favor of religious liberty in order to bring about taking it all away, which is very much the reality. And the same thing when we're discussing whose vision of human rights and how expansive it is. Well, yeah, we believe in all the human rights for ourselves, but LGBTQ people, they don't have any. And the whole thing is, then it's not a human right. Then it's our people's right, not yours. And that's the thing we have to be fighting against. And some of them, some of the leaders know exactly what they're doing and trying to do it. And they're using, as Trump did and as the Christian right did, use these issues, and they tried to create fear among people for political support, and they've been very effective at it. But I took one of my colleagues a few years ago. I've been an author of a bill, was first author of a bill to have marriage equality in Minnesota a decade ago, more than a decade ago. And when it finally passed, one of my Senate colleagues who was strongly opposed to it, who has deep religious beliefs, Christian right, but he came into my office and wanted to know if we could have a private conversation about this, because he said he knows we disagree on the issue. And he knows that I care about religious liberty, and so does he. And therefore, well, what do we say? What's he supposed to tell his constituents, the small business owners who do not think same-sex marriage is moral? It's immoral in their mind. Why should they have to bake cakes for them, etc.? And I told him, well, maybe a way to look at it is look back 60 some years, 70 years now, 60 years to the Virginia Loving case in interracial marriages, which was against the law in about 10 or 11 states at that time. And the US Supreme Court stepped in and said, this is a right. People can marry the person they choose, regardless of race, and you can't discriminate against them. Even if you're a business owner, you can't discriminate against an interracial couple. He said, well, that's different, because that's not a religious issue. That's a discrimination issue. And I said, well, I'm sorry, but in the 1960s, it was very much a religious issue. The reason people opposed the Supreme Court ruling, the reason they opposed interracial marriages, was because their Christian beliefs in their mind prohibited such race mixing. And if so, but he understood that. He understood why discrimination against the interracial couple would be unfair, but he couldn't understand how a discrimination against a same-sex couple was the same thing. I'm trying to tell him, you have the right to believe it's wrong. You have a right to not, in your church, not marry a same-sex couple or an interracial couple. That's your right to that belief. But if you're a business owner, you can't say, we're going to give these services to these folks, but because of your skin color or because of your orientation or whatever, we're not going to serve you. And I think he was just kind of stunned by that, because it hadn't occurred to him to look at it that way. And it didn't change his mind, I might point out, but at least I think he had to go away thinking, I understand why you're saying this. And I understand the difference between what I think is my religious liberty and you think is my discrimination, my ability to discriminate as a business owner.
You know, I think that there are still far more white churches, mostly in rural and small town America, that still hold to that line against interracial marriage than most of us probably think or would want to admit or face. But I come across it still all the time. And the go-to verse is, "Do not be unequally yoked." And you know, some white Christians are still holding to the old slaveholder Christianity interpretation of that verse, which means don't marry outside your race. The way I was taught growing up was that it meant don't marry anyone who's not the same kind of conservative Christian that you are, which is actually more liberal than, you know, the slaveholder interpretation, but it's still out there. And you know, just maybe to make what I was saying about freedom that was rather abstract more concrete, you can put it this way: a right-wing Christian authoritarian who doesn't think that I have the right to exist as a trans woman would argue that it's not my freedom of choice to be that, because I'm actually in slavery or in bondage to my sin, right? That's the rhetoric that they use. And if I were to be liberated by properly communing with the Holy Spirit, I would just want to go be a man. Now, we have a whole lot of evidence that that does not work, but that's still the language that they use, the language of slavery and freedom. It's very twisted and it's everywhere in their rhetoric. And to put it back in abstract philosophical terms, you know, it's very much a vision of positive liberty, right? A strict sort of positive interpretation. Liberty exists only to fulfill this ideal, as opposed to the negative liberty that we associate more with liberalism, which is freedom to do what you want as long as you don't harm other people.
Thank you, Chrissy. Oh, go ahead, Fred. No,
Yeah,
go ahead.
Cookie, thanks. Yeah, going back to what Catherine was saying about Robert P. George and the Manhattan Declaration, that began in 2009, and it was where the evangelical leaders and Christian right leaders and many of the prelates of the Catholic Church could agree for the first time on a common agenda. For the most part, they had deep suspicion and hated each other, and but they nevertheless, you know, had common views on certain things. So how could they figure it out? So they came down to a three-part agenda that they could agree on, and that was life, traditional marriage, and religious freedom. And so pretty soon, all the Christian right organizations and even the Catholic bishops had life, marriage, and religious freedom, on their websites, and they moved together as the three-part agenda. Mitt Romney even, cited those three things in his acceptance speech at the Republican National Convention. It was the thing. But something changed over time, and that was that life and marriage came to be redefined as religious freedom issues. Right. So the court cases that we saw were not about abortion. They were not about, gay marriage. They were about the religious freedom, in order to, my religious freedom is endangered, by somebody else's marriage. Or more importantly, even my religious institution, is being required, religious freedom of an institution is violated by having to provide services that might involve abortion or, say, health services to gay people. And that's the direction. It goes back to the problem that Madison and Jefferson were trying to solve, and that was religious freedom doesn't exist for institutions, it exists for individuals. And we're seeing a drift to institutional co-optation of the entire idea to advance it for their purposes. That's something that the Trump administration has helped with enormously over time.
If I could, Koki, just add to that quickly. I think we have seen what that dynamic that Fred is talking about in so many different ways. I'm reminded, even though this now feels about 15 years ago, of Amy Coney Barrett's, well, not so much even her confirmation hearings as the sort of anticipatory press before those even began, where everybody was like, oh, get ready for the most vicious anti-Catholic attacks that you are ever going to hear. And like, don't you remember that, Senator Feinstein had asked her about her Catholicism, and that was terribly anti-Catholic. And it whipped this up, this sort of frenzy of anticipation of anti-Catholic bigotry that really got reframed by the time that news cycle had sort of run through to anything asking her, like, really even about something as foundational and such a big SCOTUS question as Roe versus Wade was reconstrued to be an attack on Catholicism. And just to point out that this was also happening at the same time that the presidential campaign was going on, and Joe Biden, who is now only our second Catholic president in history, was being tarred by the same organizations that were kind of pushing that line about the Coney Barrett confirmation hearings, as he wasn't just a bad Catholic, he's anti-Catholic. He's going to hurt the Bible, he's going to hurt God somehow. And if he is elected, then Christians, faithful Christians, are going to, in some of the stuff I said, it literally said, are going to be herded onto the trains. So you see that language happening in both directions simultaneously. And it's just obviously tremendously bad faith, but it gets repeated.
It's intentionally dishonest, and people do repeat it. And the scary thing about it is how high up forget about the president and so on. But in terms of Supreme Court, I think a month or two ago, Samuel Alito on the Supreme Court gave this really weird partisan screed about how when the marriage equality amendment passed, how he and some of his conservative colleagues warned against it because it was going to trample on religious liberty. How was it going to trample on religious liberty? He actually, in a speech to Federalist Society, it's worth listening to online because it's pretty scary to see a Supreme Court justice think this way. But he was saying that the reason he objected to it was because not that many years ago, they and a lot of other people thought that marriage was between one man and one woman, and this was immoral. And now he says we could say that anywhere in society. Now we can maybe whisper it to our spouses at home, but if we say it anywhere outside of home, we'll be accused of being bigots. And we warned that this was going to happen. They were going to take away our religious freedom. And it is so incredibly backwards he's saying these other people don't have the right to believe they're bigots or to call them bigots because they say bigoted things in public. And therefore, we have to take away their liberty to do this because otherwise we might get insulted. And the First Amendment and our rights of conscience do not protect us from insults. They do not protect us from ridicule. And a Supreme Court justice having it so backwards that the religious liberty is something that he thinks of people who agree with me deserve the liberty, and anything that might infringe on us in any way is wrong. And therefore, if we have to take entirely somebody else's liberty to do anything, even to marry the person of their choice, we're going to take that away. That might infringe a little bit on what I think my religious liberty means to me. And for a Supreme Court justice to say that, it's the same thing you said about Amy Coney Barrett. I mean, the people asking, is she going to be taking away people's religious freedom, were accused of attacking her religion.
Thank you all. I think there's a lot we could keep talking about in this vein, and I want to, in the spirit of reclaiming religious freedom, pivot to talking about other forms of Christianity. I'm going to start with you, Reverend Jackson, in the Religious Coalition for Reproductive Choice. RCRC predicates its mission on religious freedom. I quote from your website, "We are attuned to the important role of our diverse faiths in personal and public life. We treasure the religious freedom guaranteed Americans since our nation's founding. Good policy allows people of all religions to follow our own faiths and consciences in their own lives." Can you talk us through this relationship between personal faith and religious freedom in the public realm and RCRC's advocacy for public policy from this view?
Yes, and I'm going to start with some history influenced by Fred and Chrissy. But back in the 14th century, John Wycliffe is attributed with writing as an opening to his English translation of the Bible, the first for the entire Bible. The Bible of the people, by the people, for the people. What is particularly interesting about Wycliffe saying that, when he translated the text that had been in Greek and in Hebrew and Aramaic and Latin, when he translated those various texts into English, he was doing that because he felt that the people needed to have access to the text and be able to interpret the meaning of those texts for themselves. We have running throughout US history that language of the people, by the people, for the people. And there's something very sacred about being able to interpret texts and interpret religious rituals and interpret the world for one's self. There is something so sacred about being able to do that. When there is someone who believes that you can only interpret the world and sacred texts, etc., through some mediator, whether it is a minister, a priest, an imam, when you think you can only get to the divine wisdom and divine truth through mediation, then that sets the stage for someone to have power over other people. When there is power over someone else and the ability to impose one's will or one's beliefs on another person, two things happen simultaneously. One, the person who is being controlled is impacted in a spiritual way in that they think they don't have the right to make the life decisions for themselves, and they are constrained from being their fullest, most authentic selves. The other thing that happens in that moment is that the person who believes they have the right to control and to oppress or dominate someone else, they are also equally out of balance with regard to what it means to be human, because then they think, I'm up here and you're down here. it keeps it very, very askew. So the reason we really promote religious freedom is because when it comes down to the very intimate decisions of reproduction for people, so whether that's contraception or dealing with infertility issues or terminating a pregnancy or adoption, whatever the issue might be with regard to someone's reproductive decisions, at the very beginning and at the very end, it is very much about who do I get to be as a full human being. Now, as an African American, I'm particularly sensitive to that because my people were not fully human. We were 3/5 at a time. We got up to 7/8, and maybe we're 7.5/8 now. I don't know. It depends on what context a person is in. I'm not going to bring in a whole bunch of other issues here, but it is a spiritual issue when someone is controlled by someone else or by an institution, be that institution be a religion or a government. And so enabling people to make independent decisions that are best and right for their lives. And this is the last thing I want to say. Karen Armstrong talks about how it is with most religions, the great religious traditions of the world, compassion and love are at the core of those religions. Yet when it comes to how those religions, many of them, how they are practiced, more of the practitioners prefer to live their lives judging other people than extending love and compassion. And so very much what we are focused on within RCRC is making sure that people get to make independent decisions about the things that are most important and intimate within their own lives. And we do that very much guided by love and compassion as a religious and spiritual principle.
Thank you. I want to stay with us for a few minutes and introduce an audience question from PRA's own Heron Greensmith. Heron writes, I'd also love to hear a bit about how even within the Christian right's narrow interpretation of religious freedom, the theology they support is even narrow within Christianity. How can we spread awareness of expansive progressive theologies? And RC does, a version of this work, and I'd be interested to hear how some of you all are thinking that through as well.
Can I hop in on that very quickly? And Fred knows this, and Catherine knows this. RCRC is in the process of launching what we call the Religion and Repro Learning Center. And we invite everyone, not just those who are engaged in reproductive freedom advocacy. But we are really looking at how religion has set the stage for the ecosystem of justice issues writ large in this country. And so much of it centering on reproductive issues, but really looking at how it relates to race and racism in this country, and immigration rights and LGBTQ, et cetera, et cetera. And so that is something we hope you'll check us out for our, again, it's the Religion and Repro Learning Center. And very, very soon, February 2nd, Catherine and some other speakers will be doing a webinar for us looking at the adoption industry and the intersection with evangelical Christian communities. And we've got to keep peering behind. So I'm excited about PRA having this wonderful conversation today. This is so important.
Thank you. Would anybody else like to jump in on this topic?
Sure.
Oh, go ahead, Fred. I was just going to recommend your very arguments on this topic.
Oh, well, please. Well, one thought is that, I think that we need to encourage the mainstream media to actually report on progressive voices who are not evangelical Christians. Now, when we hear that there's criticism of Christian nationalism and the Christian right, they usually trot out somebody who's a more moderate member of the Southern Baptist Convention, right? Or a writer, who disagrees with them about something, but it keeps it within a very narrow universe of conservative, Christianity. There are lots and lots of more progressive Christians out there, but to read the mainstream media, you'd hardly know that they were there. One of my college classmates was Bishop Michael Curry, who's now the first African-American, head of the Episcopal Church. Well, he was down on the border, praying about immigration. He was at Standing Rock, standing up to people trying to put in the oil pipeline in sacred lands. But nobody knew about that until he, performed the royal wedding. All right. Well, they didn't even know about that. They hadn't heard of him until he performed the royal wedding. And now he's the most famous, Episcopalian in the world. But that's how, celebrity culture goes. But there are plenty of other fine progressive Christian leaders in the United States. If only they would ever be reported on, then our entire religious culture might change a little bit.
I'd like to add there that, there are sort of a handful of progressive Christian leaders that do tend to get a lot of press, like Reverend Dr. Barber, whom I greatly admire. But I think that when it comes to talking about, when it comes to journalism about, for example, evangelicals or the Christian right, you're right that they don't tend to bring in any sort of outside critics, which I think is a huge problem. I mean, I would argue that when we're discussing religion, and particularly religion in its anti-pluralist varieties, well, we do need to uphold pluralism, embracing progressive Christians and other faiths. We also need to make sure that atheists, non-believers, critical scholars, and former evangelicals have a seat at the table, because all of those people are stakeholders. And there's been a kind of de facto social contract with religion reporting that you don't treat it too negatively, you can't touch people's beliefs. But when those beliefs directly harm minorities and marginalized groups, or when they have a direct impact on everybody because those beliefs are mobilized politically, then they need to be open for criticism. So there's a whole spectrum of views that I think should be included in journalism on this issue that usually are erased. And yeah, when they bring in the more moderate ones, I always kind of want to laugh about that, because it's great that Russell Moore is being such a moral voice now. But in 2007, Russell Moore called feminism and pluralism heresies. And as far as I know, he still holds to those views. And, maybe a journalist who talks to him should ask him, but they don't.
And I'll point out that until the 1970s, every major daily newspaper in the country had a religion writer. And the religion reporters actually understood that there was a broad spectrum of religion. Maybe not as broad as they should have. There were relatively small numbers of people of the Muslim faith and so on in the country, but they did try to, and they didn't say the religious voice is for this. I mean, they recognized in civil rights movement and other things there were large numbers of various religious leaders speaking out for it, but they also recognized that in the churches that things were different. But in the 1970s or so, maybe it was partly because the rise of the religious right, partly because journalists or newspapers were cutting back on their reporters who understood this more, and partly maybe because of lazy journalism. But it became, whenever there was talk about a political and religious intersection, they would call in somebody for the religious point of view, which was always the Christian right. It was the Christian voice. They actually had a group called The Christian Voice at the time, and it was always right-wing stuff. And people like myself, I've been in office since the mid to late 80s. And at that time, oh, you're a person with religious beliefs, and well, how come you don't agree with them, kind of thing. It was a reawakening that didn't really happen until maybe about 2016, when Trump and the right have been so extreme that they're beginning to realize there are more and more people of faith who are speaking out because of their faith, there are more and more progressive religious social justice organizations out there, that the media is beginning to pick up on the fact that, there's right-wing Christians and there's a whole thousands of other perspectives as well. That could be all called religious beliefs.
One more thing I just want to add real quick is that a point that Fred has made in his writings is that when we talk about issues like same-sex marriage in terms of religious freedom, we ought to mention that, there are bishops and pastors and priests and various religious leaders who want to have the right to marry same-sex couples. What about their religious freedom? It's a good way to flip the script there. And I give full credit to Fred for that. I think that would be one way to bring progressive beliefs more into the conversation.
Yeah, one other last thought, and that is that, there are, I had the opportunity to write about a conference that William Barber held in New York earlier this year before the plague shut down all conferences. And one of the people he featured at the conference was an Apache leader named Wentzler Nosey. And it was very moving because he talked about the attacks on the religious freedom of Native people by the violation of their sacred lands. In his case, a copper company wanted to dig up the sacred land in their area. And he said something that was very moving to me. And he was very grateful that William Barber, a Christian leader who's leading a Christian movement, invited him to the table and to be there to participate in these things. And he was grateful for the opportunity. And he said, the reason I say opportunity is because I believe we've never been at the table when it comes to discussion of religion in this country for 500 years, he said, before adding, it's been a long time. So I think that part of the way that we open up the discussion about religious freedom, is to open up religious pluralism. And when we say religious pluralism, we're no longer talking just about monotheistic religions or even atheism. There's other kinds of religious worldviews that need to be at the table and dealt with.
Thank you all. I think that, this is an important part of any conversation that, at PRA we're committed to making sure that we present alternatives for a way forward. And I think you all did that in spades. And we will continue these discussions and this work moving forward. Before we transition to audience Q&A, of which we've gotten really compelling questions that I would love for us to get to, I want to turn back to you, John. We're lucky to have a legislator with us today who has worked directly on religious freedom in the political realm. And I would like you to talk a little bit about the Project Blitz legislation that you've encountered in your work and how these experiences and this group of actors has come to frame your own legislative goals.
Sure. And for that, I want to say PRA and Fred are the ones who put me on to what Project Blitz is up to. And my simple description to colleagues and others of what Project Blitz is, it's the ALEC of the social religious issues. ALEC being the American Legislative Exchange Council, which has been largely condemned in the broader societal community because of the fact that it's right-wing corporate lobbyists meeting and paying for big junkets with public officials, right-wing officials, giving them sample legislation to introduce, so the same thing everywhere, strategizing together about how to do it. And I had never heard of Project Blitz except through your writings and so on. And it was an eye-opener to me because I first heard from Fred after we had been fighting off In God We Trust campaign to put those posters in the public schools in Minnesota. And it was done by one of my colleagues a minister who said, this is going to unite people. And I said, well, it sure isn't it's dividing us here. It was to build respect, he said, because kids don't have respect. This will teach respect. I said, well, we're not being treated with much respect. I came home from church that Sunday and got an obscene message on my phone answering machine about how I hate God. But it was ironic, come home from church to a message about how I hate God. But it was because that colleague had gone on Fox and Friends and they talked about how we hated God and how we were against all of this. And yeah, they very much, In God We Trust, they figure they're going to put a lot of people who aren't religious right and they're going to box them in because they'll be scared to, in a lot of political communities are going to be scared to stand up and say they don't want to put "in God we trust" there because it sounds so harmless. But what that does to the kids who don't have religious beliefs or those who have other than right-wing Christian religious beliefs, it's designed to make kids, even little kids, feel you got to be part of this team or you're out of luck. And that's insidious the way it undercuts our democracy. And this is just the beginning. The same folks are the ones who are pushing all the anti-LGBTQ stuff. They lost the social change battle because people in the last 20 years, attitudes changed, people grew in understanding. And so they're turning now to, this is a religious liberty thing. The Project Blitz playbook is really worth reading. And to me, again, as I said, I didn't think 10 years ago, was there going to have to any fights about religious liberty? Who's opposed to it? But the trouble is the people who are talking about it most in recent years are the ones who are trying to crush it, hiding behind the guise of saving it.
Do you want to say a little bit about the resolution that you put forward today?
Sure. Just introduced one today, and this came again with help from Fred and PRA in terms of helping get the language from Thomas Jefferson and the Virginia Statute of Religious Liberty. And it's a proposal, we dropped in one last year, would be to have the states declare January 16th as Religious Freedom Day. It's not a holiday or anything, but it's to draw state attention to it the same way we have a national declaration of January 16th being Religious Liberty Day, because of the fact it's such a clearly stated issue. As Fred mentioned earlier, in our resolution, we actually quoted in there Jefferson saying, this is meant for the Jew and the Gentile, the Hindu, the Muslim, everyone. People of no beliefs. It's meant for everyone. And we want to get that across. It was interesting when I first dropped this resolution in a couple of years ago after the In God We Trust fight, the author of that one saw, oh, I saw, John, you've got a religious liberty resolution. He said, would I like that? I told him, I hope so, because he says he's for religious liberty. And so it's making a statement. It's trying to get us to discuss religious liberty and what it means. And again, challenging the discussion we had earlier about how the media for so many years thought right-wing Christianity was religion. Everybody else was anti-religion or whatever.
Thank you. We dropped the link to the resolution in the chat for anyone who's interested in seeing. I'm going to shift us to a couple audience Q&A questions before we close. We have one from Paul. It's easy to talk about the Christian right. What role do liberal mainstream Christians and Christian denominations play through passivity or active collusion in supporting a Christian nationalist agenda? Any takers?
Well, I'll jump in. When I was pastor of a progressive Christian church in Connecticut, the church had founded the city back in the 1600s. And I thought, oh, for the anniversary of the church, it was one of the big anniversaries. I said, let's march through the downtown from where the initial founding of the church was to where the current location was. And as we were marching through, when I say marching, we were walking and singing and, and the congregation was really quiet. And so when we got to the area where there's a plaque about the church having founded the city and and then we walked back to our church. And so I asked them, you were very quiet. What was that about? And they said, we've never been public as being Christian. And we were shy and we were embarrassed and, and the like. I think one of the realities that we're living in, most progressives, Christianity is something that some put on and take off like a coat. And many who identify more as conservative, they don't put it on and take it off as readily. It's almost sealed to them, not necessarily because they can't take it off, but the fear quotient, I keep talking about fear today, but the fear quotient is so high, they're afraid to take it off. And if it feels that someone is trying to invite them to take it off, then they will fight for death. Progressives do not have the same motivation in a lot of ways regarding how they live out their faith, that it's a matter of life and death. I grew up in a very fundamentalist tradition, and hell was such a huge part of the context. So constantly thinking about what I do, what I say, where I go, how I show up, because of that fear of going to hell. I don't know what the impetus, that's a existential impetus for progressives. I don't know what that is. For me, as a progressive Christian, it is absolutely imperative for me that I help make somebody else's life better, or I feel I'm not doing what I'm called to do, why I'm here on this planet. Maybe some of that urgency for me is because I grew up in the evangelical fundamentalist realms. But we need more urgency, a greater sense of urgency among progressive religious people. Maybe what's happening with our democracy now might offer some of that. I don't know.
This may be a little bit off link, but I've been looking at the chat, and there's been a lot of conversation about how do atheists fit into this and so on. And I want to say that, I mean, as one who believes people have consciences regardless of their religions, or in some cases have no consciences despite their supposed religion. But I had, about 20 years ago, I was given an award from the Minnesota Atheist Association, and they wanted to know if I'd come speak to them. Sure. Would you mind if we record it? No, not at all. Oh, would you mind if we put it on the web? And we won't do that if you don't want, because they knew, oh, you'd be scared to talk to atheists. And I keep thinking, I'm not scared to talk to them. That's the whole thing. At the time, there was such a stigma in politics that you look at members of Congress, how many of them have strong religious beliefs, and well, how many of them have stated on their campaign literature their religious beliefs, because it helps them. They're scared to talk to people who don't have religious beliefs. But the thing is changing, as some of the later chat things have pointed out, the number of people who would be none of the above in terms of religious beliefs is growing significantly. And I think people who have a conscience, people, humanists maybe they call themselves or whatever, but people who have a conscience, who care very deeply, they don't need to feel on the defensive in participating in these discussions about religious liberty. Religious liberty is something for everyone, regardless of it. And so I have noticed that colleagues who, they said, yeah, no politicians ever want to speak to us. I thought, that's bizarre. And that's changed very much. Younger progressives, many of them would consider themselves atheists as well. And it's changed now. And I think people who are atheists ought to be very vocal about religious liberty as well as the rest of us should be.
With respect, though, we are still not included in those conversations very often. And I mean, I agree with what you're saying, that we shouldn't be shy about it. And it can be a bit of a hard sell in the atheist community, because many atheists are anti-theist, which I don't think is productive and helpful. And as an atheist who works both with religious organizations like the Religious Coalition for Reproductive Choice, or Christian Theological Seminary in Indianapolis, a mainline seminary, and also works with atheist groups, I'm trying to push both groups toward a more robust embrace of pluralism and accommodation of one another. But, while I think it's ridiculous, I mean, I was doing a talk for an atheist group, and one of the questions that came up in Q&A is, do you think we've already lost the war with organized religion? And I was like, well, I'm not at war with organized religion, and I think that's extremely counterproductive. But, if you're fighting that war, yeah, you've lost it. But on the other hand, there's a lot of stigma still there. So let's not be too rosy.
I understand the stigmas there, but what you're doing is exactly right. That's why I wanted to speak to them, because I know there's some who are anti-religion. Want them to see, not everybody with religious beliefs is out to crush you, and not every atheist is out to crush religion. And it's, again, the matter of religious liberty that I think all of us care about so much, is how do we respect each other as human beings? And
Absolutely.
that's why I'm saying exactly what you're saying. That's why it's important to do what you're doing, try and bring everybody together. And I think that's the obligation of each of us.
Thank you. Yeah, I think one of the ways that we need to do that is we really need to revive discourse around the concept not only of religious freedom, but of pluralism on the left in America. And what does that mean? Because like religious liberty, pluralism is mostly talked about on the right, and mostly in rather twisted ways that redound to protecting their privilege and allowing them to continue to discriminate against others. So that's something that I try to talk about a lot. What pluralism, some people look at it already as sort of a set of norms, but to my mind, I mean, what it is it's a fact on the ground. And the question is, how do we respond to it, right? And I think, to sum up, what the only sort of democratic, little d democratic way to navigate pluralism would be to provide equal accommodation to all comers in the public square to the extent possible, without allowing any one group to dominate any others. And, it may get a little thorny with evangelical, more sort of thoughtful, moderate evangelicals like the historian John Fee, bringing up the issue of Christian colleges and do they have a right to continue to police their traditional notions of sexuality? Do they have a right to exist? I mean, I think when he raised that in a dialogue we were having a while back, that the idea that Christian colleges shouldn't exist is really very much a straw man. But, if they want to enforce their quote unquote traditional views of sexuality, I don't think they should be taking state or federal funding. But anyway, that's a whole sort of other can of worms. Sorry.
So I think we've run out of time for additional questions. Chrissy, I wanted to talk to you about pluralism, and we will add some of the pieces that you've written on the topic in our follow-up email. Similarly, we will include all the links we shared today and more pieces written by the experts that we were so lucky to have on this panel. Before I conclude, does anyone have last thoughts that they would like to share, things that they wanted to respond to earlier comments?
I
Go ahead,
like
Jim.
a lot of the comments in there. We don't have time to comment on them all, but very good comments.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. Fred, go ahead.
Yeah, one last thought that sort of brings us full circle, and that's that particularly we talk about how we're going to communicate about these things. And I think we've hit on two out of three, and there's a small constellation of interrelated ideas that we have to embrace and be able to articulate well, know what the differences are, know where they overlap. And that's religious freedom, pluralism, as Chrissy was talking about, and separation of church and state. And so once we have a good handle on those things, once we know in our bones what they mean, and there's no hesitation, there's no doubt about what we think religious freedom is. It's not like, well, but Jefferson owned slaves, or well, what about freedom of religion? Like, what is freedom of religion? We need to own it. We need to value it. We need to be able to communicate it and relate it to as a fundamental value, if you will, to all of our issues, because that's the only way that our issues really are going to advance in the current climate for the foreseeable future.
Thank you, Fred. I will make one last note there. If you are interested in continuing this conversation, there is another panel at 6 p.m. hosted by the Interfaith Alliance and featuring Sarah Posner, friend of PRA. So you can take a 30-minute break and then continue in this vein and on through Saturday. I want to thank you all so much for joining us today. This is a strange and difficult time to be having public conversations, but that means we need to do it more so than ever. And I'm really glad that we took this moment to talk about the Christian right and the importance of religious freedom in our efforts to reappropriate it and lift it back up as a fundamental value and facet of American identity. We will send a follow-up email that will include a recording and the links that I mentioned already. And we hope you stay tuned. PRA will be resuming in full force our webinar series in March, including future conversations on the Christian right. So we hope to see all of you there. Thank you all so much again. Really appreciate it.
Thank you, Koki.
Thank you,
Thank
Koki.
you.
Thank you.
Thanks to
Thanks,
everyone
all.
out there.